So, yeah, I thought I would share some ideas I had for some proposals for where things stand with literacy right now. Some proposals for the future about how we can start to incorporate new types of literacy into the curriculum based on the kind of changing role of it in society itself. And then a couple of ideas for how we can actually start to teach these new types of literacy. So, just to start off, I think that the traditional form of literacy that we all kind of know about, reading skills, writing skills. So I think that's generally useful stuff. So I think in and of itself, we should continue to make sure people are learning to read, learning to write. However, I think ever since really we've seen more digital technology like computers and TVs and phones come into society, I think that's really changed a lot of the ways that we really do things. And so I think the nature of the term literacy itself has also evolved with this. So it is in the kind of strictest definition of the term. Yes, that still is letters. Literacy still does mean reading and writing, but I think a bit more broadly, it refers to how we how we do something, or how we use something in order to achieve a goal. So that can kind of change a bit on kind of depending on the context, but you know, if we talk about like media literacy, that could be how do we use the information that we're getting from a media source, something along those lines. And so I think kind of given that digital technology has changed so much, that means our idea of literacy itself has also evolved. And so the way we teach literacy skills in the 21st century should also evolve. So, in addition to teaching reading skills, writing skills, there are a couple more things that I think we should really do to add on to those. So, on its own, I think the main objective of teaching literacy has to do with the transmission of information and knowledge. I mean, I think literacy is kind of, it helps us to really share ideas with each other. So, for a long time that was either just verbally talking to each other or reading a newspaper or something along those lines. Now we we have social media sites, so I think social media literacy is going to be a very big thing going forward. We have so many new types of like media sources over our TV, things we can read on our computers. So media literacy is something that I think is going to be very important. And recently we've really seen a pretty significant development in artificial intelligence, especially the generative artificial intelligence. So I think that will also be an area where artificial intelligence literacy will be something that's going to be very big going forward. And so I think teaching that as well is going to be something that we really start to prioritize more and more in the K through 12 education system. So when it comes to media literacy, I think, well, I remember reading from earlier on this year that there's media literacy itself is the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, and create media in various forms. And I thought that was a very succinct definition of the term. So it often has to do with just how can we really, how can we consume information and really learn more things? How can we really gather new information and be able to just do it in a very intelligent way? How can we also then do it to really gain more knowledge? So I think there are a couple main skills of media literacy that are going to be very useful to teach students. So part of that is just identifying the source of something and being able to verify the legitimacy, verify the credibility of that source. I think being able to see when we're learning something, whether that's from reading an article, seeing something on TV, however we may kind of gain that new information, if we can kind of determine which parts are facts and which parts are opinions, that'll be huge. And then also just seeing, you know, is the information accurate itself, and is there any type of like bias there? So we will have to teach students starting from elementary school, how can we really determine, is this like honest, accurate, factual information? Is it biased in any way? And is it something that's, is it more of like a factual piece, an informative piece of information, or is it more of a opinionated piece? So knowing that, I think we start from when students are in elementary school and really incorporate media literacy into the curriculum there. So, there's a variety of different ways that we can really do this on like a chapter by chapter basis or even a lesson by lesson basis. But we can really just divide into each of these different sub skills of media literacy and start to see, how we can really help students develop these skills starting from elementary school. So that could be, you know, maybe we provide them with some type of like article to read and we bring up, well, is what the author is saying informative, kind of like factual piece of information, or is this something that is more of a perspective thing, an opinion article? And they have to practice determining whether that is more of a factually accurate, informative thing, or is it something where the author is trying to kind of persuade you and, convince you to take their opinion and take it on as your own? So, kind of using that as an example, well, we can really show students these are going to be examples over here where there's more like just outright informative, factual. You're just kind of worried about what is the fact of the matter, and then here are these other ones where maybe it's more of an opinion thing. I think as they get older, then we get more into like middle schoolers and high schoolers, then we're no longer going to be just kind of focusing on whether they know what the difference between a fact, kind of a fact-based article rather than an opinion-based article is. They've probably already learned it. So by that point, we may get into more of, if they have a research project, well, they're going to have to be able to verify the information that they're using in their research, and then on the project itself, they're going to have to verify that the evidence is completely factual. They're going to have to, make sure that everything they're using is really as legitimate as possible. The sources they're using are both getting cited and are legitimate, credible sources. So, maybe at that point we can start to get into things such as when you're citing a source, we'll add, there should be some type of add-on at the end of that citation saying, why did you find this source to be a credible one? Is there any type of biasm in what you're reading or learning about? Having some way of kind of showing that it is a credible source, it is accurate, factual information, and that there is kind of like a credibility to what they're researching. And so when they use it in what they're doing for their project, there is a legitimacy to what they're saying there as well. So a second area where I think there's going to be a lot of focus going forward will be social media literacy. So for that, I mean, we see so many different social media platforms nowadays. Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. There's so many. So I think there's going to be a couple real important things that we should know and also that our students should know. So I think one is just how do we kind of like responsibly interact with other people across a social media platform. You know, there's a bit of a difference between interacting with people face to face rather than kind of behind a computer screen. So one big part of this social media literacy would be just how do we interact with people and really maintain that level of respect and kindness for each other. A second thing would be, you know, since so many of these are very public spaces, public forums, well, how do we maintain our own sense of privacy? So we would have to teach students how do they manage their own personal information in a very public situation. And then third, continue to just make sure you're verifying that the information is accurate and really legitimate, making sure that some of the things that you see on social media is both accurate and realistic. So you know that's kind of going into that or those three kind of aspects of social media literacy. Well, for all three, same thing. We start with elementary school students and kind of start earlier on, and then we continue to teach them more about it and help them develop their skills for social media literacy as they go from elementary school all the way up through the K through 12 system. So, early on, if we're thinking about, how do we make sure that students are continuing to interact with each other in a kind or respectful way, even if they're not having an in-person conversation with them, when it kind of has that sense of like behind a computer screen, how to continue to treat other people like they're human beings. Well, in elementary school, there could be a way of like, we could kind of like simulate that sense of like interaction with other people, even if we're not right there face to face. We can simulate that by, I think, we could have them basically be like pen pals with another student in their class itself, or maybe another student in a different part of the grade. So they're going to have to be like writing to each other back and forth and just kind of communicating with each other, but they're not going to really be doing it right there face to face in person. So that kind of gets them started with really just have that sense of talking to another person without being in person. So that could be one option of really getting them to think about how do you continue to interact with people, be kind and respectful, and be, a good person to each other, even when you're not there in the same room as them. So there's, there's a variety of other ways in addition to that, but just as one example, that's one way that we can really start with kids when they're still young, just making sure they're kind of like learning these types of skills that would be useful for social media platforms. For something like verifying the accuracy of information that you're finding over social media, that could be something like if someone posts an article, like a link to something, whether that's a link to an article, a video, whatever it may be, some type of like news story maybe, and they say something on Facebook about, oh, well, this is what I think about X, Y, and Z. Well, if you want to know if that's like legitimate information, you could always just click into that link that they post and maybe just check it out for yourself, and then double check the accuracy of everything against a second source. And then if it seems like it's accurate and legitimate, then you can kind of take things from there. So, there's a variety of ways that you can kind of start to do things. Start in elementary school, and then, as you go on from there throughout middle school and high school, you're continuing to just do these develop these skills further. And I think for something like social media literacy, so much of that does also include you gotta make sure that their parents are very engaged throughout that entire process. I think there's a big opportunity to work with, the parent teacher association or have some type of event where you're bringing the parents into the school to kind of talk about things. But you know, a lot of the time when people are going to be using social media itself, that's going to be, when they're at home or when they're kind of in their more of the personal realm rather than school itself. So that's kind of when you're seeing their parents being the adults who are really watching over them. So making sure that we can work with parents as much as we can, I think that'll be very useful in making sure that students develop their social media literacy skills really from the time they're in kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. I think the third big area where we're going to be seeing a new kind of like a new type of literacy has to do with artificial intelligence. So that one's evolving pretty quick right now, so it's a bit tough to come up with a perfect curriculum per se, but I do think that's we should really start integrating that into the curriculum itself and really starting to at least teaching some skills that we know we can teach students as soon as we can really start doing that. So I think there's ways to use artificial intelligence to support students as they're learning things. So, I think overall, I had mentioned before that I think the overall objectives of literacy have to do with how do we really transmit information, knowledge, ideas. Well, I think we can use artificial intelligence and use artificial intelligence literacy to really help us develop the skills that we need in order to effectively communicate with each other, in order to effectively, share these ideas. So, I'm thinking, I know just from my own experience teaching, some of my former co-workers and some of the recent ones that I've had have been, um, they've used something like IXL, which is a website that helps students develop their spelling and grammar skills. And so often that is, when you're posting something on a social media site or when you're reading the newspaper, when you're watching something on the news, there's so many ways that we're really going to be using, these types of skills. And so developing the spelling and the grammar, that's always going to be useful. And it's using a type of generative artificial intelligence to really help with that. So in that case with IXL, that is, it's going to ask students to, it's going to ask them a question that has to do with, let's say the grammar. It's going to ask them, does this sentence grammatically speaking make sense? And they have to provide an answer. And depending on how they answer, well, the following question is either going to be easier or harder, depending on how they respond. And so from there, it's going to adjust it's going to adjust the difficulty of those following grammar questions based on how students are doing in order to provide the best type of real educational service possible. And so I think something like that would really help students continue to develop some of the skills that they need to communicate their ideas in the future, to share articles they've read, to kind of like really help transmit the information that they're going to need to be able to do. So that's just one example of how you can use it to really support students developing the skills they need to communicate with each other, to share ideas with each other. So yeah, I hope this was helpful and I hope it was something that's useful.